What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and getting caught up with everything I missed while I was on vacation in Puerto Rico, I want to talk about Captain America Brave New World because, ooh, do I think it was a bad movie? No, it was not a bad film. I don't think it's as bad as people are making it out to be, and I think some of that is coming from a place of unrealistic expectations, right? People kind of looking around and saying, okay, every movie has to be as good as Avengers Endgame now. The problem with that is that Avengers Endgame was only as good as it was because of everything that had happened beforehand. If that had been like the first movie they released, it wouldn't have felt nearly as impactful as it did, right? But, again, kind of focusing on Captain America Brave New World here, the reality is that I didn't really come out of the movie caring any more about the character of Sam Wilson than I did before I went in. Now, this is not a slight against Anthony Mackie. I think he's a phenomenal actor. I think this is Marvel not understanding the importance of the film that they were making, because outside of the Fantastic Four, this is one of the most important films that they're going to make. And the reason for this is twofold. The first is because Sam Wilson is the new Captain America. He's always been Falcon. We don't really know much about him. We don't know how he would function as Captain America. And so this was Marvel's chance to pitch him to us. Say, hey guys, Sam Wilson's the new Captain America. It's a new age in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and you guys are gonna love it. Here's why. And the second reason for that is, again, this is a transition film, right? This is a movie designed to illustrate to us as the viewers, we are out of the era of the Avengers as you knew them. Thor will be around, and I'm sure Tom Holland will be around in some capacity. To what that capacity is, I don't really know, right? Rumors abound in terms of how, the new Spider-Man trilogy will unfold and so on and so forth. But we have a new Black Panther, Tony Stark and Black Widow are dead, Hawkeye and Captain America Steve Rogers retired. So this is a new age. And in reality, when it comes to both of these two things, I don't think that Marvel did a very good job with either one. So let's talk about why, right? Let's kind of talk about the things that I liked and didn't really like about this film. So the first things first, I will say there wasn't really a point where I was bored in the movie. There wasn't really an instance where I was like, okay, when do we get to the post-credit scene? Because I'm really tired of this. Like, it really wasn't like it was with the Eternals, if I'm being honest with you guys. Right? It was a very, very slow film and just didn't quite have enough action for me. That wasn't really the problem here. And I'm glad about that. And I'm glad that we got some really strong action sequences. I think that Sam Wilson's ability to handle conflict the way it was shown, his agility, his ability to hold his own in any kind of a fight type situation was cool. And honestly, I think it was more interesting watching him fight than it was watching Steve Rogers fight, to be quite frank with you guys. Right? Just like flying and bobbing and weaving. There were some great callbacks to moments across the history of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. There were some callbacks to Iron Man 1. There were some callbacks to The Winter Soldier. So again, it was cool to see and kind of experience a little bit of nostalgia for, movies gone by and kind of be able to, at least on some level, revisit those moments, albeit modified in order to fit the context of the film. But the biggest issue that I had with it is that it really felt more like Marvel had a whole bunch of plot threads they wanted to resolve. And so they put them all into one movie. They slapped the name Captain America on it and then threw it out there, which I guess makes sense. Like Captain America Brave New World sounds like a far more interesting title than like Captain America Unresolved Plot Threads. But I think the issue with that is it felt like a movie with no real identity. And it felt like a movie that didn't know what story it wanted to tell. So, comes some spoilers here, and I won't go super in depth, but the general plot of this film, if you can call it that, is that it kind of brings in the idea of Celestial Island, as it's called, right? Tiamu just kind of, relaxing out there in the ocean, and he has been since he was killed, and that's now the source of adamantium in the MCU. And while it's not explicitly stated, the idea seems to be that with the United States and Japan working on a kind of treaty that would allow them access to Celestial Island, that if this treaty doesn't succeed, you would essentially see a kind of resource war in the MCU, right? All these countries vying for control of Celestial Island. But if the United States and Japan can lock it down, then at that point, right, everybody has to go through them. So kind of providing some measure of order to what would otherwise be a very chaotic situation. In the middle of this whole treaty situation, much like what you saw when T'Chaka was addressing the United Nations, I think it was, in Captain America Civil War, that suddenly Isaiah Bradley and a few others attack General Thunderbolt Ross, or I guess President Thunderbolt Ross at this point. And then, of course, once the attack's over, they don't recall anything. And so at that point, the story follows along with Sam Wilson, Isaiah Bradley, and Falcon as they try to figure out who's behind this. And that brings in the second plot thread, which is really more of a personal plot thread, I think, for Sam Wilson, which is that he is trying to establish the legitimacy of Isaiah Bradley, right? Recognizing that Isaiah Bradley was at one point essentially Captain America, right? It was a very short period of time. He donned the costume when he wasn't supposed to, and ultimately his reputation was destroyed. But it's almost kind of like a personal desire for Sam Wilson, right? As the Captain America to rectify past wrongs. And so while he and Falcon train with Isaiah Bradley and so on and so forth, the next plot thread comes in the introduction of Samuel Stearns, the leader. And you end up finding out that what had happened is that, kind of taking a page out of The Winter Soldier and the entire plot of A Clockwork Orange, that Samuel Stearns essentially brainwashed Isaiah Bradley. And the idea was that he would play a song called Mr. Blue, and that Isaiah Bradley would go on the attack in an almost kind of hypnotic state and wouldn't remember who it was that gave him those directions and wouldn't remember the attack itself, right? So at that point, it's kind of tracking down, the leader and figuring out how deep this whole rabbit hole goes and all that kind of stuff. And then by the time you get to the ending of the film, you get this revelation that Thunderbolt Ross was essentially lying about taking pills for a heart condition, was actually taking pills that were gamma irradiated. And then he transforms into the Red Hulk. And I kid you not, through like the power of love, when Sam Wilson brings in Betty Ross and then manages to talk Thunderbolt Ross down, he turns back into his normal self, the day saved, roll credits. Here's the problem with this. Right. At no point over the course of this film did it feel like a Sam Wilson film. It felt like a we're wrapping up plot threads film. And there's a huge difference between these two things. So for the sake of this discussion, let's talk about Steve Rogers for a second, right? When you look at Steve Rogers as a character, especially when you look at like Captain America 1, I don't really think he was all that interesting in Captain America 1, right? I mean, he was Captain America as he's always been in Marvel Comics, which is to say, a dude who did some stuff in World War II, and that's it. It's not until you get to the whole post-credit scene, right, where he wakes up, after having been frozen for 70 years, and suddenly his story gets really, really cool, because now he's a kind of man out of time. And in fact, I would go so far as to say that post-credit scene, when he's in Times Square and he's looking around with this sense of bewilderment and a sense of wonder and a sense of fear, that perfectly encapsulates Steve Rogers in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, right? The sense of bewilderment comes from like, where in the world am I? The sense of wonder is, I've never seen anything like this, which leads to a sense of fear, which is the feeling that he's lost. And so over the course of his time in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Steve Rogers knows that he can't go back. He can never undo what happened. He's now stuck, right, in this future point in time. But the reality is, he wants to go back because the life he lived is gone, right? The life he could have had with Peggy Carter, gone. And that's one of the most tragic parts of The Winter Soldier, when he literally has to essentially come to terms with the fact that she's got Alzheimer's, right? She just is almost kind of stuck in this loop of remembering him, forgetting him, remembering him, forgetting him. And it's painful for him to see the woman that he loved so much in that condition. At the same time, when you get to the idea of Bucky Barnes, it's his ability to make up for what he perceives to be a past failure. He couldn't save Bucky when Bucky fell off the train, but if Steve Rogers can save him, then he at least has something from the life that he had before. A friend, basically a brother, but someone that reminds him and kind of connects him back to the life that he misses so much. And so even with all that being said, the very nature of Steve Rogers himself is that despite being a man out of time, and despite being in a place that he's completely unfamiliar with and carrying around a little notebook trying to get caught up on all these things he missed, that the very fundamental nature of his character stays the same, right? Right is right, regardless of what era you're in. Fighting on the side of a righteous moral cause, the side of good, right? That's a timeless concept. That's really represented perfectly in the conversation that he has with Nick Fury, right, during The Winter Soldier. When Nick Fury says, S.H.I.E.L.D. doesn't take the world as we'd like it to be, we take the world as it is. And Steve Rogers says, that's not freedom, that's fear. And again, I'm paraphrasing a lot of this. I'm sure that conversation happened in a different way than I'm describing it here, but you guys understand the point that I'm making, right? That Steve Rogers was developed over a period of time, but like right out of the gate, right, in the future of the Marvel Cinematic Universe after Captain America 1, we understood his plight, right? Because who among us wouldn't love to go back to a time when just life felt simpler, when life felt easier, when you understood the world in which you lived. I mean, honestly, the older you get, the more you long for that feeling. But the fact is, right, we were able to kind of follow his story and identify to his story in a variety of ways. But with Sam Wilson, we never really got that. We don't know a whole lot about Sam Wilson. We haven't had any significant, telling of Sam Wilson's backstory. There's no real reason to care about him outside of the fact that he was the sidekick of Steve Rogers, and he, did some cool stuff, and he really helped out Steve when he needed it. And he turned Steve Rogers on to some really cool jazz. And like that said, presumably he turned him on to John Coltrane, hopefully when John Coltrane was on drugs, because that's when his music was the best. But the bigger point that I'm making is this. There's been no real development for the character of Sam. And so when Marvel comes out with a Captain America film starring Sam Wilson, and they say, hey, you guys are going to love his character, you have to give us a reason to. You have to give us a reason to want to care about Sam Wilson, to want to see him as Captain America. And that's where the movie really fell short. Not only that, the whole idea of stakes and the whole idea of threats and so on and so forth, those are necessary, right? Again, the reason why I use Captain America, the Winter Soldier so much is because in my mind, it's the best Marvel Cinematic Universe movie that has ever been made, right? I love it. I know, boo hiss, right? Avengers Endgame, what are you talking about, Rob? Yada, yada, yada. But pound for pound, storytelling wise, it is the best film that the MCU made. And what made it so good? Well, because it was a very simple to follow plot, but the stakes felt intense, right? And so the initial stakes of the film, right? I mean, it's kind of given to us that Hydra's taking over S.H.I.E.L.D. That's explained through dialogue. But what's the importance of it? Why does it matter if Hydra takes over S.H.I.E.L.D.? Well, because Hydra wants to kill Captain America. They want to take him out. They want to get rid of him. He's the thing standing in their way. But why does it matter if Captain America dies? Well, because Hydra is a fascist organization. Captain America represents freedom. If Captain America is killed, symbolically, it represents the death of democracy in America and its replacement by a fascist totalitarian organization that would rule everything with an iron fist, literally flying ships through the world, killing off everybody who would oppose them, one person at a time, and so when you look at that film and when we were sitting in that movie, it's like Captain America's gotta win because if he dies, America dies, right? You felt the stakes in that. In this movie, you didn't feel any stakes. Nothing was on the line. It wouldn't have mattered if Sam Wilson had lost, if he had just been beat to death by the Red Hulk. It's like, okay, well, we don't have a Captain America. They're going to have to go find a new one. There was no reason for us to care whether he lived or died. And so I guess the question becomes this, right? Because again, as you guys know, when it comes to topics like this and videos like this, as infrequently as I make them, I don't think it's enough to complain about something, right? I can train a chimpanzee to hit a red button whenever it doesn't like something. I think it's important to also say, like, here's what I would have done differently. And I've mentioned this kind of thing before. The guys who have been around the channel for a long time, you guys know what I'm about to say, right? Weapons plus. But in all seriousness, that I think would have been a great way to kind of provide some unity to the Marvel Cinematic Universe where it doesn't really feel like it has it right now. But by way of Weapons Plus and the journey that Sam Wilson is sent on in discovering Weapons Plus, that the movie becomes a very personal story for Sam Wilson, much of the same way that the Captain America films were very personal stories for Steve Rogers. And so how would you do this? Right? Well, number one, I think that bringing Samuel Stearns back was a great idea. I mean, he looked weird, right? I mean, it looked like somebody just beat him over the head just constantly and his brain was turned to mush. But, it was the Marvel Cinematic Universe's adaptation of his character from the comics, which your mileage may vary, right? Maybe you wanted a guy who looked like Skeeter Valentine from Doug, right? I don't know. But whatever the case is, I think bringing Samuel Stearns back was great. And that's what I would have done here. But instead of Samuel Stearns just serving as some kind of plot device that was used by Thunderbolt Ross in order to get himself into the presidency, that what Samuel Stearns realizes is that Sam Wilson is at a very vulnerable place. He's not sure if he wants to be Captain America, and the slightest push could potentially push him over the edge, and he just chooses not to undertake the role. And of course, Samuel Stearns, being a genius, is not one to just launch a frontal attack against, Captain America or any major superheroes. 9 times out of 10, either he operates in a group like the Intelligentsia, or he strikes from the shadows, revealing himself at the most opportune moment when he believes his plan is beyond defeat, which it never is. He gets beat all the time. But the bigger point is this. right? Samuel Stearns would initially approach Sam Wilson as a kind of, advisor of sorts, if you want to call it that. But basically saying, look, if you're going to be Captain America, you need to understand what it means. You think you understand what it means because you hung out with Steve Rogers and you guys were sidekicks, but your government is very, very shady, and it's been doing some very shady things. You need to go learn about something called Weapons Plus. And, we could go a different route in terms of how, Sam's sent on this journey. But the fact is, he's sent on that path by Samuel Stearns, with the hope of Samuel Stearns being that Sam Wilson will learn all this stuff that the government's been doing and become so demoralized, so disenchanted with the government that he's like, not a chance am I going to represent as Captain America for the United States. I'm just not going to do it. I cannot in good conscience do that, because we know by and large, because of the nature of Sam Wilson, he's very much modeled after Steve Rogers. So while they do have ideological differences, his moral code on doing what he believes to be the right thing to do supersedes all else. And so this is where you could kind of do what, Captain America Brave New World did by maybe resolving or bringing in some plot threads, but it would be done in a far better way. In the sense that you would say that Weapons Plus, instead of being a joint venture between the United States CIA and Department H like it was in the comics, that it was a Hydra program. That Hydra wanted to create new super soldiers after the perceived death of Captain America during the time when they were secretly taking over S.H.I.E.L.D. in Captain America the Winter Soldier, or at least as we learned in Captain America the Winter Soldier. And so in the years, right, going from the late 40s into the 50s, 60s, 70s, all the way up to the modern day, that they had just been experimenting on people, they'd been experimenting on animals, all in the hopes of creating these Captain America-like super soldiers, or even more capable than Captain America, that would be absolutely loyal to the Hydra cause. And that you could start bringing in these elements of the Marvel Cinematic Universe that would have otherwise felt wholly disconnected. Really good example of this is Zebediah Killgrave, the Purple Man, right, in Jessica Jones. We know that he was in a kind of program that was ran by his parents, where they experimented on him and he ultimately gained his power to emit pheromones and essentially dominate the wills of people. You could just say, like, that was Weapons Plus, and his parents were either Hydra agents, Hydra scientists, or they were just contracted by Hydra, and for whatever reason, they were just terrible people willing to experiment on their child. But whatever the case happens to be, you roll that in to Weapons Plus. You could take Isaiah Bradley and say, sure, Isaiah Bradley was a Weapons Plus project. Now, he didn't know that Hydra was running it. It's not like Isaiah Bradley was sitting in a room saying, "Hail Hydra." He was a government guy, right? He was a military guy. But again, Hydra operating in the shadows was basically conducting experiments on Isaiah Bradley and his platoon, with them being none the wiser to the fact that Hydra was the one behind it. And if you really wanted to, you could bring in the Sentry. I don't know how Thunderbolts is going to unfold, but you could say the Sentry gained his abilities because of Weapons Plus, which would really kind of enhance the story overall, because what it would establish is that, yes, Hydra launched Weapons Plus, and yes, they did some terrible things by experimenting on people, but the government never stopped. That even after Hydra was defeated in Captain America, the Winter Soldier, and Hydra was no more, or at least didn't seem to be any measure of a threat as they were before, the government was like, this is some valuable research, we can't let it go to waste. And so the government just kind of kept the experiments going. And so through all of this, Sam Wilson learning all these things that Steve Rogers didn't know anything about, I had no idea that this kind of stuff was going on, that Sam Wilson is now in uncharted waters. He feels lost. He feels more uncertain and more unsure of himself than he ever did before. And then by whatever manner and whatever means, I don't know how exactly that would play off, that Sam Wilson comes to the realization that the reality of being Captain America is, yes, you are a symbol of the United States in the world. And the United States has done some pretty terrible things, but it's also done some pretty incredible things. And that him being Captain America, being in the position that he's in, is also a position that's capable of affecting change. And so in the end, Sam Wilson decides to don the costume, and he decides to be Captain America. Now, of course, it wouldn't just be a movie about Sam Wilson, sitting in a room by way of flashbacks, talking about, do I really want to be Captain America, just moping for like 2.5 hours? That's not going to be the film. Right? I mean, you're going to have your fight scenes and you're going to have your action sequences and, your dialogue and exposition and things like that, right? But it would feel more like Captain America the Winter Soldier than this movie did. right? This movie felt like they borrowed elements from Captain America the Winter Soldier, and it felt like they wanted it to be Captain America the Winter Soldier. They just didn't quite know how to make it that way. So, we got what we got. Right? But again, this takes this movie away from being some film that's just there to resolve plot threads with the Captain America name slapped on it. And instead, it becomes a very personal story for the character of Sam Wilson. And we follow him on this journey. We follow him on this journey as he questions things. We follow him on this journey as he learns, to various degrees of just shock and disgust, how corrupt and how terrible the government has been and some of the things that they've done. But at the same time, we follow the story where there's some measure of hope, where he's like, look, we can improve things, right? We can make things better, because that's really what Captain America, that's what Steve Rogers was, right? Steve Rogers being a guy at a time, right? No matter how bad things got, right? It was, there is a way to fix this. There is a way to improve things. Now, don't, misunderstand. Steve Rogers wasn't a hippie, right? The guy wasn't sitting around all day, smoking hashish, talking about how, one day we'll make the world better. No. I mean, the guy was not afraid to, to crack some skulls. You know what I mean? Like, he killed people in the Winter Soldier. I mean, it's just, Captain America wasn't really afraid, of helping people understand their place in the bigger picture. If you guys are getting what I'm saying, and so again, I think that making this movie a more personal tale for Sam Wilson was important. I think it was an incredibly important thing to do, to give us a reason to care about him, to see his struggles and so on and so forth. Instead, we just got a movie where it's like, hey guys, so there's some plot threads that we need to wrap up, and Captain America's gonna help take care of some of it, whatever. Adamantium, isn't it shiny? And so it's just kind of like, all right, whatever. But at the end of the day, I think that my biggest concern coming out of all of this, truth to tell with you guys, my biggest concern coming out of all of this is that a single comic book YouTuber, if I'm being honest and kind of tooting my own horn a little bit, a single comic book YouTuber has been able to put together what I would argue is a much better and more cohesive plot than all the writers and the screenwriters and the team and people that they have working on this film, right? My idea was better than theirs. And I thought this up in a day. I don't know what that says, right? Take it for what it's worth, right? Maybe you think I'm arrogant, maybe you think I'm right. I don't know, but I think it says something, so it kind of leaves me a little worried about the future of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, guys, because I mean, sure, Marvel movies are always going to do well. They're always going to perform. And Marvel does kind of pride itself on making relatively simple to follow plots. But the reality of this is that we generally kind of accepted the Marvel formula in the first 10 years because for a lot of people, they didn't know who those characters were. They didn't know who Black Widow was. They didn't know that Iron Man was not a robot, that it was actually a guy in the suit. A lot of folks didn't know that. Marvel had to go on a marketing blitz to basically tell people that when Iron Man was coming out. A lot of people knew of Captain America, but they didn't really know the story of Captain America. And so because so many of these characters were such fresh faces to so many people, that the Marvel formula and the incredibly formulaic method of how their movies were made was just kind of dismissed because we were also excited about what came next. But the reality here is, it's like Don Cheadle said in Ocean's, 13? You don't do the same gag twice. You move on to the next gag. And so watching this movie and looking to movies like, the Fantastic Four and Avengers Doomsday and, Avengers Secret Wars, it kind of makes me a little fearful that despite all the, pushback that fans gave to Marvel on how Phase 4 was handled and how movies like Eternals were handled, Marvel hasn't really learned anything. So I don't know. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments section. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.